Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. That's the time on the demolition permit. I know because I stood there and watched them blast 126 years of granite into the tide. That eyesore has blocked our Marina view for 100 years, Carol Ashwood said, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. It's coming down. Today. Behind her, a barge crew set charges along my family's breakwater. My great-grandfather's breakwater. 2,000 tons of granite block, laid stone by stone in 1899, gone in 11 seconds of white smoke and falling rock. 38 Bluff view lots, sold in 14 months. $3.4 million moved through escrow accounts nobody on that board ever explained. I didn't know the number yet, not that day. That day, I just knew the sound the granite made going into the water, a sound like something dying. By the time the first nor'easter hit Widow's Point, the ocean had already started eating the bluff those 38 houses sat on. 8 feet of clay and gravel, gone in one tide cycle. Foundations cracking like dry bread. And Carol Ashwood standing on her back deck at 2 in the morning, screaming into a phone at an insurance adjuster who wasn't answering. By the end, she'd pay $3.4 million, and almost none of it was for the rocks. What she never understood, what none of them understood, standing on my bluff with their clipboards and their marina views and their contempt for an old man in a flannel shirt, was that the mud under their houses had a name on the deed. And it wasn't the homeowners association, it was mine. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I didn't do anything to them. I didn't lift a hammer, didn't cut a single line of rebar, didn't so much as raise my voice at that meeting where Carol Ashwood told me my family's breakwater was, in her words, an aesthetic liability to property values. I just stopped fighting them. I let the water do what water does. And I had the paperwork ready for 11 months before the first wave ever touched their foundations. That's the whole secret to this story. I didn't take revenge, I just stopped stopping it. My name is Walter Hobbs. I'm 63 years old. I've spent 40 years reading the ground under other people's feet, and I'm about to tell you exactly how a bluff full of $500,000 houses learned what happens when you blow up the one thing holding back the Atlantic Ocean, and it belongs to the man you just insulted. I grew up on Widow's Point, on the eastern shoulder of the Maine coast where the granite runs grey and hard almost to the surface, and where my family has been cutting stone and reading tides since before Maine was even a state that mattered to anybody outside it. My great-grandfather, Eli Hobbs, built the breakwater in 1899 with his own hands and the hands of 6 Finnish stonemasons he brought over on a lumber schooner. He quarried the granite himself, half a mile inland, and he floated the blocks down on log rafts at high tide because there wasn't a road wide enough for wagons carrying stone that size. It took him and those 6 men 4 years. When it was done, it held back the sea from 140 acres of bluff, and it's held back the sea every single year since, through hurricanes, through the Portland gale, through nor'easters that took whole piers off other stretches of coast. I can still smell that breakwater. Low tide, the granite gives off this mineral smell, wet stone and kelp and something like rust, and underneath all of it, the smell of the tar my grandfather used to seal the joints every 3rd summer. I used to walk it as a boy with my father, and he'd put his hand flat on the granite like he was checking a horse's flank, feeling for cracks, for movement, for anything the winter ice might have opened up. That's how I learned to read stone. Not in a classroom, on my hands and knees on cold granite at 6 years old, my father's voice in my ear telling me what a hairline fracture feels like before it's a problem. My father left me the breakwater and the tidal flats beneath it when he died in 2003. 40 acres of intertidal land, granite base, mud flats, and a deed that goes back to an 1897 land grant nobody in this century bothered to read closely. I became a licensed coastal geologist in 1987, spent 31 years with the Maine Geological Survey, mapped half the erosion lines on this coast myself, testified in front of the state legislature twice about bluff stability regulations. I know what that ground can hold and what it can't because I wrote the reports the state uses to decide it. I don't look like much. I drive a 2009 Ford Ranger with rust through both rear quarter panels. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. I live in my grandfather's house, the one with the hand-built oak table from 1899, still sitting in the kitchen. Deep gouges in the wood where 3 generations of hobsmen have cleaned fish and mended nets, and apparently, one time, sharpened an axe. There's a family cemetery on the bluff. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, all buried up there with a view of the water they spent their lives protecting. The people who bought into Widows Point Bluff Homeowners Association didn't know any of that. To them, I was just the old man with the ugly rock wall blocking their million-dollar view of the marina. Carol Ashwood became HOA president 2 years before she ordered that breakwater destroyed. 52 years old, silver blonde hair cut sharp at the jaw, drove a white Range Rover with a vanity plate that said BLU FVU 1. Designer blazers, even at homeowner meetings held in a church basement. She carried a clipboard everywhere, like it gave her authority nobody elected her to have. Before Widows Point, she'd run marketing for 2 failed coastal developments downstate. I didn't know that yet, not that first year. I just knew she talked to people like they worked for her, and she talked to me like I was an inconvenience she intended to remove. What none of the 38 families who bought Bluff View lots ever asked was why property values there had jumped so fast, so suddenly, right after she took over the board. What none of them asked was where the marketing money came from for the glossy brochures, the drone footage, the open houses with champagne on the very edge of a bluff that hadn't been surveyed in 20 years. They just wanted the view, and Carol Ashwood was very, very good at selling it to them. The letter came on a Thursday, certified mail, return receipt requested, which I found almost funny, since I was the one who'd end up using that method against them soon enough. It was dated March 3rd, and it said the Widows Point Bluff Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee had determined that the stone breakwater structure at the eastern shoreline constituted a non-conforming visual obstruction under Article 7, Section 4 of the Association's Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. I read that twice. My great-grandfather's breakwater, a non-conforming visual obstruction. There was a fine attached. $400 a month, retroactive to January, for maintaining a structure in violation of community aesthetic standards. I sat at that oak table my grandfather built, and I read it a 3rd time, and I noticed something. The C, and Rs they cited, Article 7, Section 4, didn't exist in the 1974 covenant filing. I know because my father kept every document that association ever filed, going back to when it was founded as a summer cottage co-op with 9 members. I had the original in a fireproof box in the closet, 9 pages, no Article 7, no aesthetic standards at all. I didn't call anyone, I didn't write back. I photographed the letter, front and back, with a timestamp. I photographed the envelope, the postmark, the certified mail slip. I drove to the county recorder's office in Rockland and pulled the current recorded CC and Rs, and sure enough, there it was, Article 7, Section 4, filed 8 months earlier, with an amendment vote that supposedly passed 68% of the membership. I made a note, amendment filing date, recorder's stamp number, time of my visit. I've learned in 40 years of surveying disputed coastlines that the ground never lies, but people do, constantly, and the only defense against a liar is a clock and a camera. Then, May 14th, 9:12 a.m., a crew showed up at the breakwater with a barge, a compressor, and enough explosive charge to open a quarry. I was up at the house when I heard the trucks. I walked down through the spruce with my old Nikon, and there was Carol Ashwood in a cream blazer, clipboard against her chest, watching 6 men in hard hats set charges into drill holes along a stretch of granite my great-grandfather had floated down on log rafts in 1899. "Mrs. Ashwood," I said, "you want to tell me what you're doing on my land?" She turned like she'd been expecting an argument and had already won it in her head. "This isn't your land, Mr. Hobbs. This is a shared shoreline easement. The association owns access rights to the waterfront for all members." "The association owns access rights," I said. "Not the breakwater, not the flats underneath it. That's a separate deed, goes back to 1897, and it's in my name." She smiled the way people smile when they've decided you're not worth the argument. Our attorney reviewed the plat maps. This structure is blocking view corridors for 38 properties, currently valued at an average of $900,000. I have a unanimous board vote authorizing removal of, quote, derelict maritime infrastructure, posing both an aesthetic and safety hazard. She held the clipboard toward me like it was a badge. "You're welcome to attend the June meeting if you have concerns. That breakwater's been holding this bluff together since your grandparents were in diapers, if they even lived here yet," I said. "You blow that out, you're going to have a real safety hazard. The ocean." "That's your professional opinion," she said, and I noticed the way she said professional, like it was a slur. "We've had an engineer's report. The structure's obsolete." I asked to see the report. She said it would be in the meeting minutes. It never was. I stood there and I let them do it. I want to be honest about that because I've thought about it 1,000 times since. I could have called the state that morning. I had the number for the Department of Marine Resources memorized. I'd worked with half of them for 30 years. I could have stopped it in an hour with one phone call about unpermitted work below the mean high water line. I didn't. I photographed the charges going in. I photographed Carol Ashwood's face when the first detonation went off. This look of pure satisfaction, like she'd just gotten rid of a stain on a white carpet. I photographed the granite falling into the tide, block by block, the sound rolling up the bluff like a door slamming somewhere underground. And then I drove home and I wrote down the date, the time, the names of the men on the crew, the barge registration number, and I put it all in a folder. Here's what most homeowners don't know. An HOA board can vote on almost anything it wants regarding shared common areas, but a board vote does not create legal ownership of land it doesn't hold title to. Article 7, Section 4 or not, 68% vote or not, you cannot destroy a structure sitting on a deed that isn't yours, and you especially cannot do it below the mean high tide line without a permit from the state under laws like Maine's Natural Resources Protection Act. I knew all of that standing on the bluff that morning. I let it happen anyway, because I wanted to see exactly how far Carol Ashwood would go before I decided how far I'd let her fall. It took me 6 weeks of quiet digging before I understood I wasn't dealing with a bossy woman who didn't like an old rock wall. I was dealing with something a great deal more expensive. It started with Eleanor Pruitt. Eleanor lived 2 lots down from me, in the last of the original cottages before the new construction started. A widow, 78 years old. Husband Frank, a Korean War veteran who died 4 years back and left her the house and not much else. She was on oxygen half the day, dragging a green tank behind her on a little cart when she walked out to get her mail. I used to see her out there most mornings, moving slow, breathing slower, and we'd wave, and sometimes she'd come sit on my porch and we'd talk about Frank, about the way the tide used to run before the new docks went in. In June, 3 weeks after the blast, Eleanor got her own letter from the association. Not a fine, worse. A structural safety notice informing her that cracks had appeared in her foundation consistent with unstable underlying conditions, and that, per the CC and RS, homeowners were financially responsible for remediation of any land movement affecting shared infrastructure, estimated at $41,000, payable within 90 days or subject to an association lien on her property. She showed me the letter on my porch, her hands shaking a little, the oxygen line trembling under her nose. "Frank paid this house off in 1998, she said. "I don't have $41,000, Walter. I don't have $4,000. I looked at that letter a long time. Cracks in a foundation, 3 weeks after the breakwater came down, on the one cottage in the whole development set closest to the bluff edge. I didn't need a report to know what was happening. I'd mapped that bluff for the state 15 years earlier. Without the breakwater absorbing wave energy, the toe of that slope was undercutting fast, and Eleanor's foundation was the first place it would show. But something about the timing bothered me. 3 weeks. That's fast, even for erosion. So I drove into Rockland and I pulled every permit, every filing, every plat amendment the association had submitted in the last 3 years. That's when I found it. 14 months before the blast, the board, under Carol Ashwood's signature, had filed a rezoning petition with the county, reclassifying 11 acres along the Bluff crest from restricted setback, coastal hazard zone, to premium residential, unrestricted view corridor. The petition cited an engineering study I'd never heard of, from a firm I'd never heard of, claiming the Bluff had stabilized significantly since the original hazard designation. 38 new lots got carved out of that reclassified acreage and sold in 14 months, every one of them marketed with the words Bluff View or Marina View in the listing. I pulled the sale prices. Average lot premium over comparable inland parcels, $89,000. 38 lots. That's over $3 million in premium alone, on land that never should have been rezoned in the first place, sitting on a bluff that only stayed put because of a breakwater the association had just spent $40,000 to dynamite. And there, buried in a subcontractor invoice I found through a public records request to the county, a marketing consulting fee paid quarterly to a shell company called Ashwood Coastal Advisors. Same last name. I sat at my grandfather's table with that invoice in my hand, and I thought about Eleanor Pruitt's shaking fingers holding a $41,000 bill for a crisis Carol Ashwood herself had engineered, and I understood, finally, that this had never been about a view. It was about $3.4 million, and a breakwater that was standing in the way of it. I sat with that invoice a long time before I did anything with it. Outside, the tide was going out, and I could hear the gap where the breakwater used to break the water. A flat, wrong sound, waves running all the way up the mud without anything to stop them. I went back to Eleanor's the next morning. She had the letter spread out on her kitchen table next to a cup of tea gone cold, and Frank's photograph in his dress uniform propped against the sugar bowl like she'd been asking him what to do. $41,000, she said again, like saying it twice might make it smaller. I called the number on the letter. A young man told me if I couldn't pay, the association would explore lien options against the property to recover shared infrastructure costs. She looked up at me and her eyes were wet, and the oxygen concentrator ticked in the corner like a slow clock. Frank fought in Korea, Walter. He came home and he built this house with his own 2 hands, board by board. And now some woman with a clipboard wants to take it because the ground moved. The ground didn't just move, Eleanor, I said. They took away the only thing holding it still. I didn't tell her everything that day. Not the rezoning, not the shell company, not the number 3.4 million. I didn't want her carrying that weight on top of everything else. But I told her to keep every letter, every notice, every phone call logged with a date and time, same as I was doing. Don't pay them a dime yet, I said, and don't sign anything. Word got around the way it does in small places. I ran into Dale Whitfield at the general store, one of the newer Bluff View owners, a retired dentist from Hartford who'd paid top dollar for a lot with a marina view and a brochure promise of century-stable coastal frontage. He had a crack in his own foundation now, thin as a pencil line but growing, and he cornered me by the coffee station, looking for someone to blame who wasn't the woman who'd sold it to him. "You're the one who owns that old wall," he said. "Rock wall's been sitting there doing nothing for years. Now suddenly it's some emergency." "It wasn't doing nothing," I said. "It was doing exactly what it was built to do. You just couldn't see it working until it stopped." He didn't like that answer. Nobody at Widow's Point much liked answers that didn't come with someone else's signature at the bottom, absolving them of having asked too few questions before they wired a down payment. I understood it, in a way. Nobody wants to think they bought a view that was never safe to sell in the first place. It's easier to be angry at the old man with the rock wall than to ask why your HOA president's name was on a marketing invoice tied to your own deed. But I kept my folder growing. Certified letters, time-stamped photos, recorder's stamps, the Reserve petition, the Shell company invoice, Eleanor's $41,000 notice. I didn't have the whole shape of it yet, but I could feel it now. The way you feel a fracture under your boots before you ever see the crack open in the rock. The first nor'easter of the season came through on a Tuesday in late September, and it wasn't even a big one. 35-knot gusts, 6-foot seas, the kind of storm this coast used to shrug off without losing a shovelful of sand. Without the breakwater, it took 8 feet of bluff in one tide cycle. I stood at my property line at dawn and watched the wave action running straight up against raw clay where granite used to break it. And I could see the crack in Eleanor's foundation from 50 yards, wider now, running clean under her back porch steps. That's when Carol Ashwood stopped being careful. I think she felt the walls closing in, though she didn't know yet that I was the one closing them. Word had got into her, probably through Dale Whitfield or one of the other Bluff View owners, that I'd been down at the county recorder's office more than once. She couldn't have known what I'd found, but she knew I was looking, and a woman running a $3.4 million scheme doesn't like being looked at. She called an emergency board meeting for October 3rd, 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse, and she had notices hand-delivered to every household on the bluff, including mine, including Eleanor's. I still have that notice. Urgent, coastal erosion emergency, mandatory special assessment vote. She wanted authorization for immediate rock armor construction along the bluff base, a rip-rap seawall, $300,000, split across 38 households, roughly $8,000 a homeowner. And buried in item 4 of the agenda, discussion of legal action against adjacent property owner obstructing emergency shoreline protection. That adjacent property owner was me. I went to that meeting. I sat in the back row of folding chairs in the clubhouse, under fluorescent lights that buzzed like wasps, and I watched Carol Ashwood stand at a podium in a charcoal blazer, clipboard set aside for once, hands folded like a woman delivering communion. "We are facing an emergency situation," she said, "created by one property owner's refusal to cooperate with reasonable protective measures." She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. 30-some heads turned toward the back row anyway. "Mr. Hobbs holds deed rights to the intertidal flats beneath our bluff," she went on, "and he has refused permission for the association's engineering contractor to place rock armor on that frontage. As a result, we are exploring a legal claim of nuisance and negligent obstruction against Mr. Hobbs personally." I didn't say a word. I'd learned that lesson already. 40 years reading rock faces for cracks nobody else could see, you don't announce what you know until the fracture's ready to give. I let her talk. I let Dale Whitfield stand up and ask, red-faced, whether the board could simply go around my permission if it was an emergency. I let another homeowner, a woman named Grace Tolliver, ask what would happen to their homeowner's insurance if the erosion kept advancing and nothing was done. Carol answered every question with the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed it in a mirror. Then Eleanor Pruitt raised her hand. She stood up slow, oxygen cart rattling on the linoleum, and her voice was thin, but it carried in that quiet room. "Mrs. Ashwood, I got a letter saying I owe $41,000 for foundation damage. I'm 78 years old. My husband was a decorated veteran and he paid this house off before he died. Where exactly am I supposed to find that money?" Carol's face didn't crack, not really, but something behind her eyes went cold and quick, like a door shutting. "Mrs. Pruitt, every homeowner agreed to shared infrastructure liability when they signed the covenants. If you're unable to pay, the association does have provisions for a lien and, eventually, foreclosure sale to recover costs on behalf of the community." There was a gasp somewhere in the room, Grace Tolliver, I think. but Carol didn't blink. She said foreclosure the way another person might say Tuesday, just a fact of business. I watched Eleanor sit back down, her hand shaking on the arm of the folding chair, and something in my chest went very still and very clear, the way it does right before I write a survey report I know is going to end a fight for good. 2 nights later, October 5th, 11:40 p.m., my dog woke me barking. I keep a game camera down by the flats, installed years ago to track erosion patterns for the state, motion-triggered, time-stamped, weatherproof housing. I went to the window and saw headlights down on the access road, no running lights on the water side, which struck me odd for that hour. I didn't go down there myself. I've learned enough in this life to know that a man alone in the dark, confronting trespassers, is a man who ends up either shot or sued, sometimes both. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and reported unauthorized vehicle activity on posted private tidal land, gave my name, gave the time, gave the parcel number. Then I sat in my kitchen with the porch light off, and I watched, through field glasses, 4 men in waders working at the edge of my flats with what looked like a small barge-mounted crane dumping quarry rock directly onto the tidal shelf. No permit flags, no silt curtain, no erosion control measures, nothing. My game camera caught all of it. Timestamp 11:47 p.m. through 1:12 a.m. 4 men, unmarked truck, a barge with a partially painted over registration number I could still make out at 400mm zoom, and at 12:22 a.m. Carol Ashwood herself, standing on the bluff top in a rain jacket, directing them with a flashlight like a woman conducting an orchestra. That's when I understood what most homeowners never learn until it costs them everything. Placing fill or rock armor below the mean high water line without a permit from Maine's Department of Environmental Protection under the Natural Resources Protection Act isn't just a violation, it's a crime, potentially charged under state law with fines running into tens of thousands of dollars per day of violation. And if it's done on land you don't hold title to, you've added trespass and destruction of property on top of it. Carol Ashwood was standing on my flats, in the dark, ordering unpermitted construction on my deeded land, 3 days after telling a room full of people she was going to sue me for refusing permission. The sheriff's deputy who responded, a young man named Corporal Reyes, arrived at 12:51 a.m. and found the crew still working. He didn't arrest anyone that night, no probable cause established yet for anything beyond a possible trespass complaint, and Carol talked fast, telling him it was emergency stabilization work authorized by the Homeowners Association Board, which wasn't strictly a lie, just a lie of omission the size of a barge. But Reyes wrote a report, time-stamped, my name on the complaint, the truck's plate, the barge's partial registration, 4 names given voluntarily by the crew when asked who'd hired them, a contracting outfit called Bluff Marine Construction, LLC. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my grandfather's oak table with my camera's memory card in a manila envelope, and I started making calls in the morning that I'd been holding back for months, because I finally had enough to make them count. I called the Department of Environmental Protection's Enforcement Division and reported unpermitted fill placement below mean high water, citing the exact GPS coordinates from my camera's metadata, the date, the time, the photographs. I called the state's Board of Licensing and asked, very calmly, whether Bluffline Marine Construction, LLC, held an active contractor's license in the state of Maine. They did not anymore. It had lapsed 11 months earlier for an unrelated bond violation. I called an old colleague at the Geological Survey and asked her to pull the original 1897 land grant and confirm, on state letterhead, that the tidal flats and subsurface bluff base beneath Widow's Point were recorded under the Hobbs family deed, unambiguously, going back 5 generations. And then I did something I hadn't done in the 6 months since that first certified letter arrived. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer, not to sue anyone, not yet, but to file, quietly and correctly, a formal notice of trespass and cease and desist against the Widow's Point Bluff Homeowners Association and against Carol Ashwood personally, served by the county sheriff's office, certified, time-stamped, with copies to the DEP, to the county recorder, and to every single homeowner on that bluff, including Eleanor Pruitt and Dale Whitfield and Grace Tolliver. I wanted every one of them to have it in writing, in their own mailbox, before the next storm came through, because I already knew, from 31 years reading this coastline, that the next storm wasn't going to be a gentle one. The Weather Service was already tracking a system off Nova Scotia, building fast, and I could read a bluff's erosion rate the way other men read a bank statement. I wasn't going to stop that storm. I wasn't going to stop what the ocean was about to do to 38 foundations sitting on a rezoned lie. But for the first time since that first blast went off in May, I had every piece of paper I needed to make sure the only person who paid for it was the one who'd ordered the dynamite. The second nor'easter came through on October 22nd, and this one had teeth. 48-knot gusts, 10-foot seas, stacking up against a bluff that no longer had 2,000 tons of granite standing between it and the Atlantic. I stood at my property line at first light, with Corporal Reyes beside me. I'd called him personally the night before, told him what I expected to happen, and asked him to be there when it did. County Emergency Management was already on site, along with a DEP enforcement officer named Marjorie Kwan, who'd been building a case against Bluff Line Marine Construction for 2 weeks based on my complaint. What we watched that morning wasn't rock armor holding. It was 38 feet of raw clay bluff sliding into the sea in one long collapse, taking Eleanor Pruitt's back porch with it, cracking Dale Whitfield's foundation clean through and exposing rebar and sewer line under 2 other houses like ribs on a carcass. The unpermitted riprap Carol Ashwood's crew had dumped hadn't been engineered to spec, hadn't been keyed into the toe of the slope properly, hadn't done anything but sit there while the real erosion cut in behind it, undermining everything from beneath. County Building Inspector red-tagged 4 houses by 9 that morning. Uninhabitable, pending structural review. Eleanor Pruitt stood on my porch in her robe, oxygen line trailing, watching a chunk of her own backyard go into the water, and she didn't say a word. She didn't have to. I'd seen that look before, in my 31 years, the look of a person watching the ground itself betray them. Carol Ashwood called another emergency meeting for that evening, October 22nd, 6 p.m, same clubhouse, same folding chairs. Except this time, the room was packed. Every homeowner on the bluff, a reporter from the Rockland Courier I hadn't invited but was glad to see, and, standing quietly near the back doors where I'd asked them to wait, Corporal Reyes and Marjorie Kwan from the DEP, and a State Assistant Attorney General named Paul Denby, who I'd spoken with 3 times in the past week about a rezoning petition that never should have passed. Carol stood at the podium in a cream suit, composed, clipboard back in hand like a talisman. "I know everyone is frightened," she began. "The association's engineering team is already drafting an emergency armor solution. You don't have permission to place armor on that shoreline," I said. I stood up from the back row. 40 years of testifying in front of legislative committees taught me how to make a quiet voice carry in a loud room. You never did. That's tidal land and subsurface bluff base recorded under my family's deed since 1897. I have never signed a permission agreement, and after tonight, I never will. Somebody in the 3rd row, Grace Tolliver I think, said, "Wait, what does that mean for our houses?" "It means," I said, "that without my signature, no barge, no crew, no rock touches that shoreline. Ever. Not legally." I pulled the folder out from under my arm, the one I'd been building since March, and I handed copies down the rows. The 1897 deed, the recorder's stamp, the state survey confirmation from my old colleague at Geological Survey. You should also know that the rock your board already placed there was dumped without a DEP permit by a contractor whose license lapsed 11 months ago, on land they didn't have authorization to use. That's not my emergency to fix. That's a crime scene. The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet you get right before a slope lets go. Carol's composure cracked for the first time I'd ever seen it. "This is absurd," she said. "This man has obstructed reasonable safety measures for months out of pure spite, and now he's threatening." "I'm not threatening anything," I said. "I'm telling you what's already true. And while we're at it, maybe you'd like to explain to this room why 11 acres of hazard zone Bluff got rezoned 14 months before you sold 38 lots at an $89,000 premium each, and why a company called Ashwood Coastal Advisors was collecting a marketing fee on every one of those closings. I'd never said the number out loud before that night. $3.4 million. I said it now, slow, so the reporter in the back row could get it exactly right in her notebook. That's when Paul Denby stepped forward from the back of the room, state ID in hand, and said Carol Ashwood's full name out loud, Carol Ann Ashwood, and informed her that the Maine Attorney General's office had an active investigation into fraudulent rezoning practices and undisclosed financial interests related to Widows Point Bluff subdivisions, and that Corporal Reyes was there to place her under arrest on charges related to unpermitted construction below the mean high water line and criminal trespass on private title property, pending further charges from the Attorney General's office for securities and real estate fraud. I want to tell you it felt like triumph. It didn't, not exactly. It felt like watching a fracture finally give way after months of pressure, inevitable and a little sad, and completely necessary. Carol Ashwood stood at that podium in her cream suit, with 30-some of her own homeowners watching, her clipboard still in her hand, and Corporal Reyes walked her out through the folding chairs in handcuffs, while Dale Whitfield sat there with his mouth open, and Grace Tolliver started crying, and Eleanor Pruitt, sitting in the front row with her oxygen tank at her feet, just nodded once, like a woman who'd waited a long time to see the ground settle right again. The DEP shut down all work at the site within 48 hours. The Attorney General's office froze the association's accounts and Carol Ashwood's personal accounts pending investigation. And it didn't take long, once forensic accountants got into those books, to find exactly what I already knew was there. The final tally, when the state finished its case 8 months later, Carol Ashwood pled guilty to felony theft by deception and unpermitted destruction of a coastal protective structure, along with violations of Maine's Natural Resources Protection Act for the unpermitted fill work. She was sentenced to 4 years with 2 suspended and ordered to pay $3.4 million in restitution, the full amount of the rezoning premium she'd funneled through Ashwood Coastal Advisors, split between the defrauded homeowners and a court-ordered coastal restoration fund. She lost her real estate license permanently. Her Range Rover, it turned out, was leased, and the leasing company repossessed it the week her accounts froze. Bluffline Marine Construction's owner was fined $180,000 by the state for operating without a valid license and for unpermitted fill placement, and barred from bidding on any coastal contract in Maine for 10 years. 2 of the 4 board members who'd rubber-stamped Carol's rezoning petition without ever reading past the summary page were removed by the state's oversight board and personally fined $12,000 each for breach of fiduciary duty, though neither faced criminal charges. Willful blindness, it turned out, wasn't the same as fraud, at least not in the eyes of the law. The association itself, restructured under court supervision, was ordered to pay for engineered, permitted armour construction along the undamaged sections of Bluff, funded by the restitution money. And this took some doing on my part. Sitting across a table from the county's coastal engineer for 3 long afternoons, I agreed to grant a proper, permitted easement for that new construction, on my terms, at no cost to homeowners like Eleanor Pruitt, provided the work followed my specifications for wave energy dissipation, the same specifications my great-grandfather had figured out with granite blocks and log rafts back in 1899. Eleanor Pruitt's $41,000 lien was voided entirely, and she received $67,000 from the restitution fund for foundation and porch repair, more than covering what the collapse had cost her. At the association's first legitimate election under new bylaws, the homeowners, nearly unanimous, voted Eleanor Pruitt in as the new HOA president. She told me afterward, sitting on my porch with a fresh oxygen tank and a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, that she never in her life expected to run anything again, let alone a homeowners association, but that somebody needed to sit in that clubhouse and remember that Frank built his house with his own hands, and it ought to still be standing in 50 years. I stood at the Bluff line the following spring and watched the new armour go in, not granite this time. The state required engineered riprap to modern spec, but placed exactly where I told the crew it needed to go, keyed into bedrock, angled the way water actually moves instead of the way a marketing brochure wanted it to look. I walked the flats at low tide the way I did as a boy with my father, hand flat against the new stone, checking for movement the way he taught me. It held steady under my palm. I still keep my grandfather's oak table in the kitchen, gouges and all, and some evenings I sit there with the folder, thinner now, most of it filed away with the county for good, and I think about how close those 38 families came to losing everything over a view they were sold with a lie. Here's what I learned, watching this play out over a year and a half. The ground under your feet always tells the truth, even when the people selling it to you don't. A deed from 1897 is worth more than a clipboard from this morning, and the quietest man in the room is usually the one holding the paperwork that matters most. Eleanor still comes up to sit on my porch some evenings, oxygen cart parks by the steps, and we watch the tide run in against stone that's finally doing its job again. Last week she mentioned that a company out of Boston has been quietly buying up storm-damaged lots 2 coves over, offering cash, no questions asked, to desperate owners, and that the name on the paperwork sounded awfully familiar to a certain kind of financial shell game I'd only just learned to recognize. I told her I'd take a look at the deeds. But that's a story for another evening. That night, though, I want to tell you what happened after the cameras left, because the courtroom parts never show you the ordinary aftermath, the small human wreckage and repair that goes on long after the reporters stop calling. Dale Whitfield came by my place in November, hat in his hands, looking like a man who'd rehearsed an apology the whole drive over and forgotten half of it by the time he knocked. "I said some things at the store," he said, "about your wall doing nothing. I was wrong. I'd like to help pay for the upkeep going forward, if you'll let me." I told him the state was already funding the new armour and he didn't owe me a cent, but if he wanted to do something useful, he could walk the Bluff line with me twice a year and learn what a hairline crack looks like before it's a problem. He's done it every spring and fall since. Turns out a retired dentist has a decent eye for detail once somebody points him at the right thing to look for. Grace Tolliver took longer to come around. She'd lost the most in some ways. Her house was one of the 4 red-tagged, and she spent 4 months in a rental in Camden while contractors argued with insurance adjusters about who owed what. I saw her at the general store around Christmas, thinner than I remembered, and she stopped me by the register. "I keep thinking I should hate you," she said. "You're the one who let it happen. You stood there with a camera instead of a phone call to stop it." "I know," I said. I didn't argue with her. There wasn't an argument that would have made her feel better, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "I made a choice that cost you a summer in a rental. I won't tell you it was free of cost to anybody but Carol Ashwood, because it wasn't." She looked at me a long moment, arms crossed over a bag of groceries. "The restitution paid for the repairs," she finally said. "More than covered them, actually. And my house is worth more now than before, once people understood the new armour's permanent, engineered, guaranteed." She almost smiled. "Frank Pruitt's wife tells me you're a decent man underneath all that quiet." "Eleanor's kinder to me than I deserve most days," I said, and that got an actual laugh out of her, first one I'd heard since the collapse. Even Corporal Reyes stopped by once, off duty, driving his own truck instead of the cruiser, just to see the new stonework going in. He stood at the bluff edge with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the crew set the last course of riprap into the toe of the slope. "Never seen a case break quite like that one," he said. "Woman standing right there with a flashlight, ordering her own crime like she was conducting a symphony." "She thought nobody was watching," I said. "There's always somebody watching a coastline like this one. That's the whole job. He laughed at that, shook my hand, and left me alone at the bluff with the tide coming in low and easy against stone that finally, after a year and a half, was doing exactly what stone like that is supposed to do.